At the end of part 1, we drew an ellipse that moved and grew over time. The black stroke around the ellipse accumulated to give the moving ellipse a black trail. Let's try removing that black stroke around the outside. Well, that's easy to do. I'll just put a call to no stroke here at the beginning of draw, and I'll run this again. So now the ellipse is drawing on top of itself. It's leaving this trail behind. And the upper left looks okay, but again, each new ellipse now is overwriting the previous one because we're getting this solid ellipse. So let's just draw the outline of the thing. So I'll tell you what, instead of calling no stroke, I'm going to call no fill. And I'm going to tell this thing, I just want you to draw the ellipse itself, just the outline. So I'm going to change fill to stroke. And now we're just drawing the stroke on every frame. Let's see how that looks. And all the strokes add up one over the other because we're not erasing anything. And this is starting to look just a little bit more interesting. It has a little more complexity to it. And we're getting this kind of nice color gradation inside. And again, I just sort of picked weird colors, and so we're getting whatever. But you get the idea that we can add up shapes. And of course, we can do this with any geometric shape. I'm just using an ellipse for fun. Now we still have a background color here. We have a background of medium gray because that's the default. I want my dark background back, but the problem is I've commented out background. Well, I'm going to move that up in this program into setup. So now I only draw the background once in setup. That gives me my nice dark background. Let's run it. And from then on, I'm just drawing the outline of each ellipse. I'm just drawing the stroke. Now, normally this would be a mistake. Normally, you want to put the call to background in draw. But for this example, where I'm deliberately leaving a trail, then I take the call to background out of draw. If you see this kind of thing happening in your own code and you don't want this, a very likely suspect is that background is not being called at the beginning of draw. So I'll tell you what, just to get an idea of what's happening here, let's go ahead and put the background back in. And I'll put it back into draw, just so we can watch the ellipse itself over time. So there's a little thin ellipse, and it's changing over time, and we get to see what it was that was accumulating. I'm drawing the same thing I drew in the last movie, but I'm just not clearing the screen before each frame. I'll move it back up to draw. And you can see that with just a few simple commands, we are able to create something that looks kind of interesting. Now, of course, eventually this thing stops being interesting. It either goes off the screen or it becomes the whole screen, or somehow the picture stops changing because frame count becomes huge and things stop happening. We will see how to fix that and how to handle that. But for this week, don't worry about that. Let that be part of your design. So things can move off screen, things can sort of stagnate. Use that as part of your design. And feel free to create variables. Now, in this case, I'm not doing a whole lot with these variables, but you'll see that I am doing things like the blue is 2 times the red. That would be hard to do if I was writing just stroke RGB with just regular numbers. I'd have to type everything in. By using variables, it makes it easier for me to go in and tweak each one of these one at a time without trying to write a huge long line. Imagine how long the line for ellipse would be if we packed all of those 4 variables into one line. It would be huge. There are a few things to remember when using variables, and I want you to know about these so that you don't get surprised by behavior that might not meet your expectations. The first is never assign to frame count. We've been using frame count, adding it to things and dividing by things, but we never put a number into frame count. You may be familiar with other animation systems where you can create loops and things by assigning to some variable that is keeping track of where you are in the frames. That's not the way processing works. Processing thinks of frame count as a number that starts at 0 and goes up by 1 for every frame it draws as long as your program is running. You should never stick a value into frame count. We will later see ways of creating loops and doing all of those other things, but never put a value into frame count. You can And surprisingly, processing lets you do it, but you're just asking for trouble. Now, another place that you're asking for trouble is if you change the size of the graphics window. Again, you can. You can call size more than once and give it a different width and a different height. So you might imagine an animation where the size of the window is becoming wider and then narrower. Don't do that. You can. Your program will run, but it's likely to produce really erratic results, and it's not guaranteed what's going to happen between systems. And really, I just wish processing didn't even let you do it. So we will see a way to make it appear that your window is getting bigger and smaller over time, but the size of the graphics window remains fixed. So call size just once at the beginning of setup and don't call it again. Finally, one thing to keep in mind about the way we're using variables and the way we just saw them in draw is that they go away at the end of draw. Variables have no memory from one frame to the next. And this is another thing that we absolutely will discuss, and I will show you how to make variables that remember their values across frames. And it's a very useful technique, but we'll get to that. We haven't seen that yet. When you create your variables inside of draw, between the curly brace and the closed curly brace that show you the beginning and the ending of draw, those variables exist only for the duration of that frame. When the frame is over and processing hits that closed curly brace at the end of draw, all those variables go away. Then when processing calls draw again, it's just as though it had never called draw before ever. And in fact, the first time it calls draw, of course, it never has called draw before. And so all those variables are new. Then the end of the frame comes, it draws the picture. Now we are at frame 1, it calls draw again, and everything starts over. So don't expect if you stick a value into some variable, it will remember across frames. It won't. It forgets at the end of the frame. Later on, we will see ways to get variables to remember their values, but we haven't seen that yet. So there you go. You can use variables anywhere you put a number. You can add them and multiply them. You can create little placeholder variables. You can use the center of the ellipse for the red value. You can do whatever you want with these numbers and change them over time to create animation.